Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a particular pleasure to be here on this day. It was a total accident, but it made a great deal of difference to me. And I want to say that this accomplishment that was announced 60 years ago today at the University of Michigan represents collective action. This wasn't just my father's work or the work of the experts on his team here at the University of Pittsburgh. This was the collective action of the entire country who came together through the March of Dimes, giving dime by dime, dollar by dollar, the resources necessary to accomplish not only this, but other jobs that had to be done to get control of the huge epidemics that were taking place of this crippling disease that in 1952, just 3 years before, had affected 58,000 people in this country, and around the world, about 500,000 people a year being affected by this paralyzing illness. What I want to do today is to address the question of where do we go from here? What are the tasks that we have ahead of us as a people, as a species? And to start with something that my father's less well known for, which is his thinking about humanity and where we stand in the scheme of things and what our job is now in this present moment. So I'm going to present 3 different charts that he put together during the course of his life in his later years, and then go from there. First, let's find ourselves in time. The population of the world grew very slowly over many, many thousands of years, and then with the accumulation of knowledge with the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, over the last several hundred years, the population has grown exponentially. We're about here in time, and where do we go from here? We can't keep going like this forever. We live on a finite planet. There's just not room for more than a certain number of people. Will we be like the deer who live in a limited environment and overgraze it? If that happens, their population will crash. That doesn't seem to be a desired outcome for us. Or will we follow the trajectory that can happen in many different living systems? For example, fruit flies. If you take a couple of fruit flies, put them in a box, feed them continually, their population will begin to grow exponentially, but it will reach a point where somehow the fruit flies know, even though the food is there, how to regulate the growth of their population, and the population will begin to grow less rapidly and then plateau. Let's take a look at this curve, the one that's shaped like an S, curve number B, to see the 2 different characteristics of its shape. In the first part of the curve, which my father referred to as epoch A, the population is always increasing. Growth is the driver. The second portion, which he called epoch B, the curve begins to flatten out, separated by a point of inflection where the shape begins to change. What my father thought was that the driving forces in these 2 different parts of the curve are different. In the first portion, where the emphasis is on growth, different characteristics in the human population may support that. The emphasis is on growth and overcoming external constraints that limit our ability to grow. In the second portion, where the curve is growing more slowly over time, the emphasis is not on growth, but on stabilization of growth and on imposing self-restraints rather than overcoming external constraints. And here in this portion, what he reasoned was that among the many different characteristics that we have within us as a species, as people, as organisms, some would be more predominant and more important, perhaps, in a sense, in this first period where growth was the driving force. Things like competition or a win-lose kind of an attitude. Whereas in this second portion, the characteristics that would need to be emphasized, all part of our human nature, would be those of cooperation, those of having a win-win attitude. So the question in his mind was, what do we need to do if we're going to have a transition from this kind of a curve, which can't continue to go like this, into a successful as opposed to an unsuccessful outcome? How can we help to emphasize the qualities that will support that trajectory. So what I want to do is to look at one of his images, again, looking at the world over time, and he was looking at this from an evolutionary point of view, in terms of evolutionary progress, from the time of the Big Bang, when the universe came into existence, where particles, fundamental particles appeared, coalesced into atoms, stars, galaxies, solar systems, atoms into molecules. This phase of the evolution of our universe, he thought of as being pre-biologic, before life came on the scene. And then, when these fundamental materials organize themselves into cells, and then individual cells into multicellular organisms, and then ultimately, in a sense, from our point of view, into this very complex organism of being human, this phase of evolution he thought of as the biologic phase, and that's what we usually think about when we think about evolution. But then he looked around and said, what is going on now in this phase of our existence? There is continued evolution, but it's not our growing different numbers of fingers or different physical characteristics. The evolution is taking place on the level of our minds, on the level of our culture, on the level of our collective society. And this phase of evolution he considered to be the metabiologic phase of evolution. So what we are experiencing now is that, of course, there's continued change going on all around us. The world doesn't stop, the solar systems and the different organisms and so on, but our culture is changed, our minds, our ways of thinking. We've heard today so many of the rapid advances in so many different areas, which have effects not only on ourselves, but also on our environment, on the other organisms that exist on this planet, and on the materials that make up this world. Looked at from that vantage point, what my father saw was that as humans, we may need some help in changing slides. Okay, got it. That we are a product of the process of evolution, but we have now become part of the process itself. So our thoughts, our activities are all feeding back on ourselves and the world around us. Now, I want to ask a question, which is, we have learned so much about fundamental processes, fundamental aspects of how the genes work, DNA. We can now do so much to manipulate biological systems. We've learned about chemistry and about atomic energy and about fundamental particles, and built very exquisite tools and instrumentation to learn about the fundamental principles of nature, and have made use of these to change the world around us, to change our life. The question is, what is the deep level? What's the deepest structure of nature? And is there anything about that that could be of value to us as we confront the change in the world around us? If we want to look for the deepest structure of nature, where are we going to look? My thought is that we might need to consider this portion of this curve, which is before the Big Bang, before all of this came into existence and began to evolve. Where did everything come from? Where did the universe emerge from? Did whatever that was go away at the time the universe appeared? Or is it still there now as a fundamental level of nature that can be examined, that can be explored, that can be made use of? Actually, I'm going to go back here for a moment and just say that one of the things that we've learned about the deep levels of nature is that there are particles, and let's look at an example of a particle. Light is made up of photons. These are particles. They can knock into things and cause them to recoil, but their fundamental nature is waves. You can see that light has a wave structure through diffraction and so forth, the waves interacting. So what from one vantage point may look to be a particle, something that's bounded, from another vantage point is that it's a wave. And in the case of photons and light, these are fluctuations of an underlying field, an electromagnetic field whose activity is experienced as photons, or as light. Over time, with the development of physics, what's been understood is that there are 4 different seemingly fundamental fields of nature. The electromagnetic field, there's the field that supports the weak nuclear interactions, there's the field that supports the strong nuclear force, and there's the gravitational field, seemingly separate fundamental fields. But as we've built more and more energetic super colliders and so on, we've been able to determine that over time, there's been a unification of these various fields, or a progress in that direction. So some decades ago, it was determined that at the deeper level, the electromagnetic field and the weak nuclear force, that field, were one and the same. And then sometime later, more energetic experimentation, and it was determined that that electroweak field was the same as the field that supports the strong nuclear force. So at the moment, there's that grand unified field on the one hand, and the gravitational field on the other. The direction seems to be there. Physicists don't agree as to what the final outcome is going to be, but I find it personally compelling to think that when all is said and done, what's going to be determined is that there's one underlying unified field that manifests in these different characteristics on the surface, but that is the fundamental basis of nature, where the universe emerged, that continues in existence, supporting all of what we see around us. So the picture then of the world would be perhaps more like this. We have all sorts of things, trees, dogs, people, houses, whatever we see around us that are absolutely there, real objects, but looked at from another angle, they're just waves of expression of an underlying unified field of existence. So what good does that do us thinking in that sort of way? If we want to consider that perhaps there is such a thing as this underlying unified field of existence, what good is that? What can we do with it? Can we use it to our advantage in the same way that we've used the understanding of other fundamental aspects or deeper aspects of nature to improve our life, to improve our existence, to make changes in the world that will be a bettering of our experience in life? If we're going to explore that as a possibility, how are we going to go about doing it? Are we going to build yet more energetic super colliders? How will that help us? We may understand some of the inner structure better, but how will that help us on a practical level? What I'd like to suggest is that we need to take advantage, or we may be able to take advantage, of another aspect of existence that's somewhat different in character. And that is the subjective aspect of existence, something that we all experience as human beings. We're experiencing it right now. This world is not just full of stuff and objects. We're experiencing it. We're aware. We're conscious. We're sentient. We have this experience of subjectivity. Where did that come from? If the universe is only made up of particles and atoms and molecules smashing around together haphazardly, forming different structures in various degrees of complexity, looking back at that from this vantage point, why would we imagine that consciousness somehow would be part of this picture? It's enough that there are things knocking around against each other. So if we look at our own experience, we know that we're conscious. We look back at our pets and we can think, it looks like they're conscious too. We get down to cells and amoebas and bacteria and then viruses. It's a little bit more of a question mark as to, is there subjectivity at that level? Molecules, atoms, particles, is there subjectivity down there? So there may be different ways of thinking about things. One way would be that in addition to anything that exists, having mass being matter, having energy, It may be that there is a subjective aspect of existence that's contained in everything, and that coming into these very complex settings may be magnified, so to speak, in a way that we're now experiencing a full-blown, fully developed experience, or at least quite a complex and integrated experience of consciousness. So what would that then look like in terms of our picture of the universe, our picture of our own experience? Perhaps more like this, that not only are we an expression of the underlying unified field in terms of our physical structure, but also our subjective experience is a manifestation of another quality contained in this fundamental aspect of existence. So if that's the case, what can we do with it? How can we make practical use of it? How can we take advantage of that for ourselves and for society as a whole? What I want to, well, first of all, I think it's not going to be a super collider that we use to examine the properties of this underlying field. Yes, we can do that from one level, but in terms of the subjective aspect of this underlying field, if this is a reasonable postulate, we may be able to use this instrument that we already have, this highly complex piece of machinery, 100 billion odd neurons, nerve cells, to use it in ways that can help us examine and explore and make practical use of the characteristics of this fundamental level of nature. And what are some of the characteristics? I just want to say a little bit more about waves and their interactions. If you have two photons, let's say, that are not coherent, they'll have a certain amount of energy and a certain intensity to the radiation. So if I had a flashlight in my hand and shown it on the screen, there'd be a certain amount of light that you'd see. And what is involved there is that the intensity of the radiation, the intensity of the light, would be proportional to the number of photons being emitted incoherently. But this laser, if it were to stay on, the battery may be running down. But this laser is based on a different principle, which is that the photons are lined up. They're phase-locked. They're coherent. And in this case, they reinforce each other. And the intensity of the radiation is no longer proportional to the number of photons. It's proportional to the square of the number of photons. So far more intensity for the same number of photons. There are other kinds of characteristics that result from the wave nature of materials, of energy, of matter. Let's take helium, a gas, and cool it down. It will become a liquid. And that liquid, if you cool it to the right point, begins to display some extraordinary qualities. If you start a liquid spinning and you let it go for a while, the inner friction will slow it down and it will stop. You put it in a glass, it will stay there. That's what we expect. That's what we experience in the world around us. If you get liquid helium to the right temperature, it no longer is bounded in that way. It begins to behave as a superfluid. If you start it spinning, it will keep spinning forever. You put it in a container, it won't stay in the container, it will flow out of the container. And interestingly enough, it's behaving as though there's no more disorganization present, no more entropy present in the system. It still has entropy, but one of the features of liquid helium is that in a superfluid state is the so-called two-fluid model, where the superfluidity is mediated by a subpopulation of the helium atoms that maintain the superfluid state, and there is still entropy, disorder present in the system in the rest of the population of atoms, but even having a proportion of the atoms behaving as a superfluid will be enough to make the whole fluid behave in that special way. So what does that mean for us as people? What if we're able, as individuals, to open our awareness to that aspect of our own awareness that's part of this underlying field, or this postulated underlying field, which in and of itself is coherent, cohesive, in a sense infinitely coherent, correlating all of the different types of potential energies and waves and matter and so on, but in a completely unified state. If we were able to do this as individuals and somehow begin to be influenced ourselves by this underlying cohesiveness, coherence, and then as a group, collectively having this experience, becoming more unified and coherent on the level of society, beginning to bring out this underlying quality into our macroscopic lives, into the realm of our day-to-day living. So I'm putting this out as a possibility, something that we might consider as a potential for taking advantage of a deep structure of nature that we don't ordinarily think about, but that may not just be there on a theoretical level, may be able to be made use of practically. So what might this mean for us in terms of our present situation? Unfortunately, there's a piece that's missing on this slide, and it's missing right here. You can see the little gap, so this may be a transition from one computer program to another. What you would see here, if the slide were complete, was that same illustration from, let's see if I can get back there, from this earlier slide, namely these two uncorrelated waves. So that we would be moving conceivably from a situation of an uncorrelated state to one where there was more cohesiveness, more correlation. And the question is, let me say one more thing. There's a transition that may take place from one epoch to another, one set of characteristics and qualities to another. Question is, will this be a bland transition? Is it just, well, we're going from this shape to another shape and from competition to cooperation, and it's just sort of you don't really notice it? Or is it possible that this will be a phase transition in the same way that if you take water and you cool it down, it goes from a liquid to ice, a phase transition. Take water, heat it sufficiently, it will become a vapor, a phase transition. The transition to a superfluid state with liquid helium, another phase transition. Might we be facing a similar phase transition based upon the potential ability to make use of this underlying field in this way? So I just wanted to put this out, to go back to those two questions in a sense. What is the deep structure of nature? Well, we don't really know, but this is an idea that I think is an intriguing one. And why does it matter? It could matter because it might make a very practical difference in our lives if we can find the appropriate ways to take advantage of it in the way that it would be useful. So we could end up thinking about this kind of a period in our human existence as being one that represents our action as a collective system to reform our world, to reform our society. And that what you can't see, these two uncorrelated shapes, may be the outdated norm. So I thank you. It's a pleasure being here, and thank you very much for the invitation.